Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. I am Terry Smith, proud alumnus of the Central Methodist class of 1966 and a professor of political science at Columbia College, and I'm honored to introduce tonight's speaker. Before I do so, however, I want to pay tribute to Dr. Harold Sunoo, with whom I had the great good fortune to study while attending here, and after whom this wonderful lecture series is named. Dr. Sunoo was a gifted teacher. He was not flashy. Rather, his success came from being soft-spoken and understated. We had to pay attention to what he was saying, both because he spoke gently and because he was subtle. One day in Far Eastern history and politics, he gave us a key concept in Confucianism and wrote it on the board in its Chinese character. As he was writing it, he said, "I'll write it in Chinese so you never forget." It took us a while to understand that he was kidding, but then again, maybe he wasn't kidding. He was also a mentor and role model. On Parents' Day, my junior year, I had the first opportunity to introduce him to my father and mother. It was on the walk between Howard Payne and Classic Hall on a beautiful September day. I'll never forget it. And when I introduced them to him, he said, "I'm glad to have Terry as my student. He's doing a good job in my classes and has a fine future. I know you are very proud of him." My folks were, of course, pleased, and I was thrilled for two reasons. He had said these nice things to my parents, who were, after all, paying the bills, and he was, of course, saying them to me as well. As someone who's been in higher education without pause since I was a freshman here at Central, I've spent decades gathering lessons about how to enrich the college student experience. That bright day in 1964, I learned from a master the wonderful lesson of making parents feel good about their students' achievements and education and empowering the student as well. I have taken the opportunity to do this with my students and their parents whenever I could. In addition to teaching us history and political science and life lessons, Dr. Sunoo also gave the world the sacred gift of his lifelong striving for peace with all his acts and words. My alma mater is fortunate that his family endowed the Dr. Harold W. Sunoo World Peace Lecture so that each year we can hear the thoughts of a distinguished citizen on the subject of world peace. And we are fortunate tonight to have such an individual. Marie Dennis is co-president of Pax Christi International, the global Catholic peace movement, a position she's held since 2007, and now shares with Bishop Kevin Dowling from South Africa. She worked for the Mary Knoll Office for Global Concerns from 1989 to 2012, shaping American and international opinion. She was named Person of the Year by the National Catholic Reporter in 2016, so honored because she was a forceful advocate for the idea of making peace in today's world requires not only new ways of acting, but also of seeing and thinking about gospel nonviolence. She has written or co-authored many books and holds a master's degree in moral theology from Washington Theological Union. She is a mother of 6 adult children. Here are 3 things about our speaker that are not in her biography, and she probably won't mention during her talk. She loves to bake bread. It's one of her favorite hobbies. She has met Pope Francis 3 times, and she is a trained physicist. What a diverse background. Ladies and gentlemen, with pleasure, Marie Dennis.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It's a delight to be here. I've enjoyed learning a bit about the university. I enjoyed reading about it in advance, and I'm even more impressed with what I've learned tonight. So thank you all. I'm also very humbled to be asked to give this lecture. I hope that it is interesting to you, and I would challenge you to interpret this into your own context. What I'm talking about, what I will be talking about, will have a broad scope. I'm talking about the international reality, the world we live in, and all of its problems. But each of us, I believe, has a responsibility to find ways locally to make peace, to promote a nonviolent way of life. So be thinking about your own context as I speak. The scene is painfully familiar. A crisis captures the attention of the world. North Korea and the US are dangerously posturing with nuclear weapons in the mix. Rohingya Muslims are fleeing brutality in Myanmar. Thousands of Yazidis are caught in the Sinjar Mountains, where they fled from rapidly advancing ISIS militants. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians are under siege in Al-Raqqa and dozens of other cities across Syria. People, especially women, are in danger from unrelenting violence in South Sudan or the DR Congo. There is no question that the world has to respond to situations like this. Yet, when we consider the options, we find every time that the military toolbox is full to the brim with weapons and well-trained personnel, while the active nonviolence toolbox is almost empty. That is surely not surprising, because in the US, as an example alone, we've been spending on the order of $600 billion, this year $700 billion a year preparing for war, and nothing preparing for peace. In other words, we are very well prepared to win the war, but woefully unprepared to win the peace. We have seen the violence repeatedly horrify our own communities as well. Parkland and Ferguson, Las Vegas and Charlottesville, Baltimore, Chicago, Orlando, now Pittsburgh. The physical violence of sexual abuse or mass shootings, the structural and systemic violence of poverty, racism, othering, the psychological violence of moral injury, intimate partner abuse, trauma, and the ultimate violences on the near horizon of climate catastrophe and nuclear war. The human community simply cannot sustain the levels of war and violence that have such unconscionable consequences. We have to find a better way to live together on this planet. The Reverend Jim Lawson, a United Methodist partner and a key figure, as you know, in the US civil rights movement, tells the story of his introduction to a better way. Quote, "I had my first racial insult hurled at me as a child. I struck out at that child and fought the child physically. Mom was in the kitchen working. In telling her the story, she, without turning to me, said, 'Jimmy, what good did that do?' And she did a long soliloquy then about our lives and who we were, and the love of God, and the love of Jesus in our home, in our congregation. And her last sentence was, 'Jimmy, there must be a better way.' In many ways," he said, "that was the pivotal event in my life. There is a better way. There are alternatives to violence. There are alternatives." Not long ago, I met a remarkable young Muslim woman, Ala Murabit, who founded an organization called The Voice of Libyan Women. Together, these women, mostly young women, walk into the homes and schools and workplaces where they know extremists are gathering and create a dialogue with people who feel they have no alternative. They draw on religious discourse in their own tradition, on Libyan culture, as entry points while using education and media campaigns to change attitudes. In Manila, in the Philippines, local churches are effectively organizing resistance to the draconian assassinations of accused drug users being carried out by the Duterte government. In Rwanda, during the 1994 genocide, the Muslim community, both Hutu and Tutsi, simply refused to participate in the killing and actively and very creatively protected people in their own community whose lives were endangered. Women in particular have been creating these alternatives. In Colombia, women's groups have negotiated local ceasefires with armed groups and won the release of hostages. They've pressured insurgents to lift roadblocks and documented human rights violations. Women have protested budget priorities of local governments and sought solutions to drug trafficking and other illegal activity. It was women who kept the plight of the war's victims, now addressed in detail in the peace process, in the public eye. In Liberia, a women's peace group helped end a bloody civil war. Some of you might have seen a film called Pray the Devil Back to Hell that was a wonderful account of this women's movement in Liberia. The Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace movement brought together thousands of women, both Christian and Muslim, to engage in nonviolent demonstrations against the war. They pressured then President Charles Taylor to attend peace talks in Ghana, at which the women waged a sit-in and blocked all the doors until a peace agreement between the conflicting parties was realized, for which Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Lema Gabawi were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. In both of those instances, in Colombia and in Liberia, a very brutal war had been waging for decades, and they were able to actually bring it to some kind of a conclusion. Women in Northern Ireland, another place where the violence had been endemic, had an important role to play in drafting the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. The Cross-Sectarian Women's Coalition secured language in the Good Friday Agreement on victims' rights, as well as provisions for reintegration of political prisoners, integrated education, and mixed housing, issues that were not being discussed by the main parties to the conflict. The coalition represented women across religious and political divides and promoted an agenda of inclusion and reconciliation. Women were also important in bringing peace to Bougainville in the South Pacific. Bougainville's struggle for more autonomy from Papua New Guinea resulted in violent conflicts between rebel forces and the government in the late 1980s. Despite being victimized themselves during the conflict, women mobilized, mostly through church communities, to put an end to the violence. They met with the rebels, petitioned the government, advocated for the destruction of weapons, distributed relief assistance, and organized large peace forums. I'm convinced that women will be the backbone of what I believe can be a paradigm shift away from violence that we, and as Pax Christi and many others, are advocating. The organization that I lead, Pax Christi International, is a global Catholic peace movement with 120 member organizations working for peace on 6 continents. Founded at the end of the Second World War to promote reconciliation between the French and the Germans, Pax Christi members share a very deep commitment to active nonviolence. We believe that much more creative energy, as well as intellectual and financial investment in the development of effective nonviolent approaches to peacekeeping and peace building are essential to addressing the tremendous challenges of the 21st century. For our members around the world, nonviolence is a spirituality, a way of life, a deep commitment to live the values that we believe shaped the early Christian community in the 1st century in a context of occupation, where violence was a way of life. For us, the so-called hard sayings in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount are central. But the challenge is how to interpret that message in the context of a 21st century world immersed in extremely complex situations of violence. What does love your enemy mean now? Yes, at a personal level, but perhaps even more importantly, what does this worldview offer now in the political or public arena? In the public arena, nonviolence is often misrepresented, misunderstood, too narrowly defined, or wrongly dismissed as either passive or utopian. Very strong evidence, however, suggests a different conclusion, that active nonviolence is both powerful and effective. It is also much, much more than participating in a demonstration or chaining yourself to the fence or crossing a line. It is much bigger than civil resistance, although our most often, the examples we most often hear about nonviolence or active nonviolence are Dr. King and Gandhi in India. They're only two examples of what is a really large field that needs more attention. There are alternatives to violence, and they are neither passive nor utopian. In fact, one of the great gifts of our age is the growing recognition of active nonviolence as a positive and powerful force for social justice, a process for ending violence without lethal force, for transforming conflict, and for protecting the vulnerable. In recent years, groundbreaking empirical research has demonstrated the effectiveness of active nonviolence and the importance of increased investment in understanding, developing, teaching, and scaling up nonviolent approaches to solving major U.S. domestic and international crises. For example, Maria Stephan, who works at the United States Institute of Peace, and Erica Chenoweth, a professor in the University in Colorado, conducted a landmark study of nonviolent civil resistance campaigns over the span of the 20th century. Reported in their book called Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, their study has gotten a great deal of attention. Stephan and Chenoweth collected data on all major nonviolent and violent campaigns for the overthrow of a government from between 1900 and about 2006. The data covered the entire world and consisted of every known case where at least 1,000 observed participants were involved. That was hundreds of cases. They found that from 1900 to 2006, nonviolent campaigns worldwide were twice as likely to succeed outright as violent insurgencies. Not only that, but that this trend has been increasing over time, so that in the last 50 years, nonviolent campaigns are becoming increasingly successful and common, where violent insurgencies are becoming increasingly rare and unsuccessful. This is true even in those extremely brutal authoritarian conditions where you would expect nonviolent resistance to fail. The answer seems to lie in people power itself. Chenoweth and Stephan's data showed that no single campaign had failed during the time period they studied after the campaign had achieved the active and sustained participation of just 3.5% of the population. Every single campaign that surpassed that 3.5% mark was a nonviolent campaign. In fact, nonviolent campaigns were on average 4 times larger than the average violent campaign, and they were often much more inclusive and representative in terms of gender, age, race, class, and the urban royal distinction. Moreover, 75% of the violent campaigns failed, while a majority of the nonviolent civil resistance campaigns were successful. Just as interesting is a 2013 study of political mobilizations by a political scientist, Victor Assal and colleagues, who found that the most surprising variable affecting a movement's decision to adopt nonviolence is the organization's ideology regarding the role of women in society. Some authors argue that women's understanding of power and control – actually developed the tactics of civil resistance. Most of what we commonly call women's history, some say, is actually the history of women's role in the development of nonviolent action. Furthermore, feminist scholars studying early Christian writings recognize that for centuries, women's resistance has had a form of its own. Additional empirical research speaks to the effectiveness of other nonviolent approaches and to the importance of increased investment in developing, teaching, and scaling up nonviolent strategies, from conflict transformation in neighborhoods and restorative justice practices in schools to early warning and atrocity prevention mechanisms at a national or international level, to unarmed civilian protection, and to multiple levels of dogged diplomacy. The United Nations right now is closely examining what makes for peace. The inclusion, for example, of, quote, peace, justice, and strong institutions as Sustainable Development Goal number 16 in the Sustainable Development Goals was a very important step toward a more complete ownership by all UN member states of the interconnectedness of peace and development. Goal number 16 in the Sustainable Development Goals says, without peace, stability, human rights, and effective governance based on the rule of law, we cannot hope for sustainable development. My point is that there is an increasing recognition that if we are going to address serious social problems, problems of development, whether that is global poverty or climate change, that we also need to be paying a close attention to the need for peace, that perhaps the greatest disruptor of the achievement of sustained development in a society is the propensity for violence. And likewise, one of the greatest contributors to and consequences of climate change is tied to the propensity for violence. We can talk more about that if you're interested. The high-level independent panel on UN peace operations in 2015 was an external body that looked at the United Nations, at all of the peace operations of the United Nations. Their report, I think it was issued in 2015, was very specific in emphasizing the importance of preventing armed conflict, of mobilizing partnerships to promote political solutions, of employing unarmed and civilian tools for protecting civilians. Think about all of the instances that I named as I began to speak. For me, the story from a few years ago of the Yazidi people who were caught on top of the mountain in the northern part of Iraq. The world knew that they were trapped, that they were fleeing from a very violent ISIS expression of ISIS in Mosul and the region where they lived. And the response of the world was, we need to respond. How can we protect these people? But our ability to imagine non-violent, non-military solutions to that kind of a crisis was very, very limited. This particular study at the UN emphasized the importance of inclusion, healing, and reconciliation if we're going to build peaceful societies. If we don't address the trauma in a local community, whatever is the root of that trauma, we will not achieve the kind of stable and peaceful society that we look for. We have to address the underlying causes of conflict. Why is there violence? What are the complaints? We need to revitalize livelihoods in conflict-affected economies. We need to rebuild confidence in political processes and in responsible state structures. We need to reform police, promote the rule of law, and ensure respect for human rights. A package of responses to or efforts to prevent violence that can be very effective in building a peaceful society. The International Peace Institute And the Earth Institute at Columbia University and a number of other universities and organizations have been helping UN member states explore the concept of sustaining peace that came out of that review process in an effort to focus on the need for building peace in its own right, and not only in post-conflict situations. What actually makes for peace? How does one society manage to remain peaceful and another not? What characteristics are common to societies that don't make war? Other organizations, the Alliance for Peacebuilding, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, the U.S. Institute of Peace, are examining closely the intersection of effective nonviolent civil resistance strategies and successful peacebuilding strategies. The power of this intersection makes sense. We need to listen to people, to the complaints and the desires of the local community, and we need to engage with decision makers, political decision makers, and others in order to make change happen. I've recently discovered an amazing little book called Opting Out of War, which illustrated that important research, analysis of case studies, and ongoing dialogue among activists and academics, peacemakers and policymakers are beginning to reveal important lessons about what makes for lasting and just peace, what some, as I said at the UN, are calling sustaining peace. The authors of Opting Out of War, Mary Anderson and Marshall Wallace, studied 13 cases of communities that actually opted out of war. They were in many different parts of the world. They were in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Colombia, Mozambique, Rwanda, Fiji, Burkina Faso, India, Kosovo, Nigeria, the Philippines, Sierra Leone, and Sri Lanka. Their conclusion was that the prevention of violent conflict is doable. Normal people living normal lives have the option to say no to war, no to violence. Anderson and Wallace have begun to identify crucial common characteristics in the different communities that deliberately avoided being drawn into war. And in some of those instances, for example, one example was a small city in the middle of Bosnia when the rest of Bosnia was completely engulfed in war. Another was the example that I used earlier of the Muslim community in Rwanda in the middle of the genocide that overtook Rwanda in the middle 90s. Others were in the southern Philippines, where the conflict between rebel forces and the Philippine government has been ongoing for many, many decades and on and on. Their conclusion was that there were many different strategies that local communities were using in order to stay out of war, and that in fact there was only one community that managed to opt out of war that did so for religious reasons, and that was the Muslim community in Rwanda. In every other instance, I think every other instance, the local communities decided that they were not going to go to war because it wasn't good for their community, that their community would be destroyed, or that they would lose ground in the sort of building a quality of life that was a decent quality of life. And they decided as a community, large or small, that they simply would not participate. It was also striking to me that one of the characteristics that was important for communities to be able to avoid being pulled into war or terrible violence was the need to have a good leader, a leader who would lead them to peace and engage the community in imagining another way of being. Many different styles of nonviolent action has been employed by our member organizations around the world for as long as we've existed. We have been involved in trainings in strategic nonviolence, for example, for communities negatively affected by mining and extractive projects throughout Latin America, We've been involved in the accompaniment of communities at risk in different countries in the Middle East, in Sports for Peace programs in Haiti and South Sudan. We've been involved in reintegrating former combatants into their communities in the DR Congo. Very difficult situation when young people are attracted to one or another militia group and often forced to commit terrible atrocities, violences in their own neighborhood, in their own communities, to find ways for the community to be willing to allow them to return is an enormous challenge. We've been involved in creative advocacy to move increased spending on military preparedness toward more spending on diplomatic solutions, even when the violent conflicts that we're facing are extremely difficult. But we still struggle ourselves to understand the power and the potential of nonviolence. What happens most often when we begin to talk about active nonviolence or nonviolence is that someone pats us on the head and says, well, that's really nice, but it's pretty utopian. That might work in some easy circumstances. But I think what is being discovered now is that that just isn't true, that it is neither utopian nor unrealistic, and it is possible. It's a wonderful example of an organization called Nonviolent Peace Force that you may have heard about. The participants in Nonviolent Peace Force, actually a paid job, they are invited to go into a community that is experiencing violence and to help that community, if they don't already have skills for self-protection without violence, to help them learn methodologies of self-protection, or by giving a particular situation more visibility, they sometimes can diminish the violence. A very interesting example has been, I know that Nonviolent Peace Force has worked in Mindanao in the Philippines, in the South Sudan, in Sri Lanka, in Iraq, and a number of other places. And one very simple, very interesting example that they use a lot is when the latest violence in South Sudan began to intensify in 2013, many local communities were simply displaced to any place that they could find shelter, and they were often gathered into refugee camps that were not very secure. And in almost throughout South Sudan, because there are almost no public services, women have to go out of the encampment or the village to gather to get water or to gather wood for cooking fires. And every time women, for a long time, from a particular community, women were going to collect water or to gather firewood and were being attacked, they were being raped, they were being very violently attacked. When Nonviolent Peace Force was asked to accompany this community, they simply accompanied these women when they went to get water or they went to get firewood, and the violence actually stopped in that community. Small thing. I don't think that we imagine that the kind of power that a very simple action can have. Given what we now know about the consequences of war, physical, economic, psychological, ecological, environmental, and what we've witnessed over and over as wars either go on and on and on, or fail to accomplish what was their stated purpose, it seems evident that if we're ever going to achieve the kind of real security for which we all long, we collectively need to fill the public policy toolbox with effective conflict prevention, peace building, and nonviolent tools. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which is a project of Pax Christi International, is a partnership among prominent Catholic organizations already deeply involved in peace building, with networks of thinkers and peace practitioners around the globe who strongly believe in the power and enormous potential of active nonviolence. the possibility of actually building an entirely new nonviolent stage on which we humans are called to act out our stories and live out our relationships, whether personal, interpersonal, national, or global. Every major faith tradition agrees with this, from Jain to Jewish, Muslim to Buddhist, Baha'i to Shinto to Sikh, Native African to Native American to Christian. Nonviolence is a constructive power and a methodology for actively challenging and overcoming violence without using violence, for engaging, transforming, and resolving conflict, and for fostering just and peaceful alternatives. In the last century, Catholic teaching on war and peace has begun to shift from what was an exclusive reliance on the just war tradition to a greater openness to nonviolence, not only as a personal option, but as a tool for public policy as well. I understand that a similar conversation is also taking place in the United Methodist Church, and many faith traditions are very far advanced in this conversation. In April of 2016, 85 people from around the world gathered in Rome for what has been called a landmark conference on nonviolence and just peace. Invited by the Vatican and Pax Christi International, participants came together to try to imagine a new framework for Catholic teaching on war and peace that would help the world move beyond what was feeling like perpetual violence. Central to our conversations were voices of people promoting active nonviolence in the midst of horrific violence. They came from Iraq, Sri Lanka, Colombia, South Sudan, the Congo, Mexico, Afghanistan, Palestine, El Salvador, the Philippines, Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Burundi, Guatemala, Uganda, South Africa, Mexico, and more. Their testimony about the power of nonviolence and the urgent need to end war was extremely powerful. Iraqi Dominican sister Nazik Mati, whose community was completely destroyed by ISIS in the northern part of Iraq, said, "Which of the wars we have has been a just war? In my country, there has not been a just war. War is the mother of ignorance, isolation, and poverty. Please tell the world. I say this as a daughter of war. We can't respond to violence with worse violence. In order to kill 5 violent men, we have to create 10 violent men to kill them. This encourages the violence up and up. And the people are so exhausted they don't know it's happening. It's like a dragon with 7 heads," she said. "You cut one and 2 others come up." So we try to create an environment of nonviolence, she said. Ogari Yunan, who co-founded the Academic University for Nonviolence and Human Rights in Lebanon, shared her positive experience of equipping youth educators and community leaders throughout the Middle East with nonviolent skills to end vicious cycles of violence and discrimination. A priest from Colombia, Francisco Duru, talked about the use of the just war paradigm by all the different sides in the Colombian War that lasted for 50 years. The guerrillas, the paramilitaries, and the official army all claimed the just war tradition as their reason for being involved in the war. Over and over again, as Francisco and his team moved around the country of Colombia during the last years of the war, they heard from campesinos, from native people, from Afro-Colombians, from people whose youngsters had joined the guerrilla groups, the paramilitary groups, and the army, say, "Stop the war, just stop the war now," from all sides. Gathered in Rome, we heard very similar stories from many of the conference participants, courageous people in local communities living with unimaginable danger. People like Archbishop Odama from northern Uganda, whose diocese was terrorized by the Lord's Resistance Army, and who simply said, "Stop. There are other ways to deal with this," as the Acholi Religious Leaders Network from northern Uganda ultimately did. At the same time, as United Methodist ordained elder Tracy West says in Wounds of the Spirit, quote, "We must measure Christian ethics by the extent to which its rhetoric on violence is applicable to the circumstances of women's lives. This is the proper test of the viability and adequacy of its moral prescriptions. Thus, instead of beginning with the issues or the perspectives of either pacifism or just war, or questions about geopolitical violence, West begins with the experiences of women of color and the issues of intimate and societal violence. And rather than advocating for nonviolence per se, she calls for the development of what she called an ethic of resisting violence against women. Some say that the just war framework might be very useful for scholars and possibly theologians and thinkers at a distance from war, but that on the ground, it simply makes no sense. During the conference, we wrote an appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence, and we urged the institutional Catholic Church to follow the example of the World Council of Churches and other faith communities, including Quakers and Mennonites, Church of the Brethren, and others, and to integrate gospel nonviolence explicitly into the life, including the prayer life and the work of the church through dioceses, parishes, agencies, schools, universities, seminaries, and so on, adopting just peace as one example of a new nonviolent framework for church teaching. Our message on the possibility of a just war was clear. We said, we believe there is no just war. Too often, the just war theory has been used to endorse rather than to prevent or limit war, suggesting that a just war is possible, that all of the many criteria that would be used to claim that a war was just, criteria like this was the last resort, there was no other approach that could be taken other than war, that there was proportionality, the cost, the consequences of a war would be in proportion to the benefit of a war, that civilian communities would be protected from the violence and so on, that it is suggesting that all of the criteria of a just war could be met. Also, we believe, undermines the moral imperative to develop tools and capacities for the nonviolent transformation of conflict. Tracy West's caution is crucial. War is not the only violence with which we're contending. That's obvious in our own country. Creative nonviolent strategies must also be able to help our local communities resist the violences of racism, of poverty, gun violence, sexual abuse, and intimate violence. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative that grew out of the Rome Conference as a project of Pax Christi International believes that communities of faith, and in particular universities, can play a major positive role in making this happen. One of the reasons that we're a Catholic organization, but one of the reasons that we have particularly tried to engage the institutional Catholic Church is simply because of its size and reach. Catholic Church has diplomatic presence in almost every country in the world and at all major multilateral organizations. They have a well-developed network of Catholic universities, seminaries, religious communities, local parishes, publications, media outlets, and on, and a membership of 1.3 billion people. The question that we've been asking the institutional church is, what if 1.3 billion people understood the power of nonviolence and committed their lives to learning how to make that an actual reality in our world? In the past few years, we've engaged in a very serious conversation with the Vatican and with local communities around the world, including, again, in many war zones, about the breadth and potential of active nonviolence to further sustaining peace in our own communities as well as on the other side of the world. An ambitious, carefully organized international process of discussion and discernment on different themes related to nonviolence and just integral peace, involving theologians, peace practitioners, activists, and academics has just finished. We've explored a systematic theology of nonviolence, a careful scriptural study of nonviolence. We've begun to articulate a new moral framework that will include some or all of the norms developed by the just war tradition, but are hoping that we can leave the language of just war behind. We've reflected on women and nonviolence, on ecology and nonviolence, on nonviolence in many different faith traditions. And we've gathered excellent, really quite amazing examples of nonviolent actions in different circumstances from around the world. We're also engaged in conversations with many different universities in this country, in San Diego, University of San Diego, DePaul University, Marquette, Boston College, Georgetown, and many others, encouraging universities to both sponsor conversations, colloquia, seminars, courses that dig deeply into the many different dimensions of active nonviolence, as I said, from trauma healing to diplomacy, to restorative justice, and to many other in between. We're also working to identify more clearly public policy proposals at the United Nations, around the US government, with the European Union, and elsewhere, that would promote peace building and nonviolent approaches to national and international conflicts, so that the world will have alternatives when a crisis occurs. We believe deeply that as a global community, we have a responsibility to protect people, communities that are threatened. We are not suggesting that passivity is an answer, but that we can find other ways to provide protection, to prevent violence, to transform conflict before it becomes violent than we're using right now. And finally, we've initiated a global campaign, social media campaign, #ThisIsNonviolence, using social media and a number of other formats to just help people imagine and invest in developing more robust nonviolent tools. The picture, the image that I like the best in this, in our campaign, is of soccer players in Haiti who were former gang members and whose engagement in a very active soccer set of soccer tournaments and learning how to play soccer has completely transformed their life and their local community. The reality of the need for creative imagination is very, very present in our own community as well. And I would encourage you, as you move through life, as you look on your campus or look in other communities in Missouri or beyond, where are you seeing people deal with potential violence or even actual violence and doing it nonviolently? Can you imagine learning how to communicate with another person nonviolently? Can you imagine finding ways to transform a potentially dangerous situation without allowing, before it becomes violent? I think we hear a lot, these days about the need for civil discourse, for civility. I think that at a very deep level, the practice of learning to live, to move through life nonviolently, and then to support ways of dealing with violent situations nonviolently is a step toward the kind of civility that we surely need. The United Methodist Church in the Book of Discipline says, "We believe war is incompatible with the teachings and example of Christ. As disciples of Christ, we are called to love our enemies, to seek justice, and to serve as reconcilers of conflict. We insist," the Book of Discipline continues, "that the first moral duty of all nations is to work together to resolve by peaceful means every dispute that arises between or among them." The United Methodist Global Board of Church and Society continues, "If we are to live into our mission of transforming the world, we must prioritize collaboration among nations. work to reduce the use and need for weapons, and foster just, equitable, and durable solutions to the root causes of conflict. The obstacles are huge. The topic of nonviolence sometimes sounds abstract, but in reality, the future, if the world is going to have a future, has to learn to be nonviolent. We know that there are many powerful forces behind the big business of making war, but we can live our way into the challenge of building a new stage for Earth community's story by nurturing a spirituality of nonviolence, by learning to interact with friends and neighbors nonviolently, and by working for a just peace wherever we're planted. It seems to me that the first place that can begin to happen is on your own campus. And I would very much encourage you to do that. In many of the campuses that we're dealing with, we've also encouraged students, undergraduate students and graduate students, to consider taking a topic related to nonviolence for a research project. Study one of the thousands of experiences of nonviolence in different parts of the world. Get in touch with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict that actually maintains a database of areas of study that are desperately needed to move this effort forward, to make a commitment to nonviolence not feel like a utopian project that is simply the idea of a few faith communities that want to move in that direction, but a real route to the kind of peaceful, stable, and life-giving opportunities that we all desire. So, thank you very much. I don't know if we have enough time for a few questions, but I'd be glad to, love to have your comments or questions. Yes?
Firstly, thank you for coming. It's been interesting. I'm very interested in the topics you discussed today. Although I'm very sympathetic to the message in general of nonviolence, especially those, you could say, more passive means, such as enhancing education in less developed countries and enhancing better healthcare. I do have the one question for you, which is, let's say we're in the year 1944, and you got the choice. You can make the choice if the United States are going to intervene in Europe in the Second World War. What, according to the principles of your organization, would you do?
That's a very real question, and it's a hard one. First of all, we are not suggesting that in every instance we will be able to find nonviolent ways to respond in extreme situations. We hope we'll get there, but if we don't start now, we will never get close to that. In reality, in a situation such as the reality of the Second World War, I would say that the effort to find a nonviolent solution needed to start a long time before 1944, and that whether it was the proposal of the Jewish community in the United States in 1934, that there be a global boycott of Germany that might have actually shifted the future of Hitler's project, or whether it was a more just solution to the First World War that set up a condition that was so difficult. So we are absolutely not saying that there's always an answer that is nonviolent. But what we believe is that there are a lot more answers that are nonviolent than that we've been looking for, and that the kinds of examples that you started with are essential to that project, and that I think that's true whether it's locally here in the United States or in other countries. And I think what is really, really important about it is that we believe that nonviolence will look different in different contexts. So nonviolence in Washington, D.C. is going to look different than nonviolence in South Sudan. And nonviolence in Cambodia is going to look different than nonviolence in Geneva, and on and on. So it's really important that we both understand the reality, and the other thing that's really important is that conflict, we are not suggesting that conflict is avoidable. Conflict is part of life. The question is, how do we deal with conflict? Conflict is not necessarily violent. We're also not suggesting that powerlessness is a desirable place to be. We believe that there is tremendous power in nonviolent choices, and that the challenge is to recognize where there is conflict, and to find ways to transform that conflict into a more positive direction in society. And I think that holds at almost any level. So it's a long term. These are not. There are not very many nonviolent solutions that are quick and dirty, that are short-term, quick solutions. And so that's why when the Yazidis, by the time the Yazidis get to the top of the mountain in northern Iraq, we can't start making up nonviolent responses. And although there were some seeds of ideas, but it just, we need to be about that work all the time. Other comments, questions? Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning, do you feel that more women would be able to handle this than men?
It's been interesting to see the examples and the research that is, I think, leans in that direction. What has been shown is that the involvement of women in peace and security issues across the board is almost essential for them to be successful. I think men absolutely can engage nonviolently in many, many different ways. I think the point is that, well, there are a couple of points. One is that often because of it's not because of women's nature, but because of women's location in many societies, that the need that they have to creatively change a situation without resorting to violence has been very important. So the suggestion is not that it's nature, but location that tends to make a difference, and why women have tended to engage more in some of the major nonviolent actions. I also think that the reality of not just our culture, but the way cultures sometimes direct women and men in many situations has created a situation where the women are more willing to act nonviolently. It's also the issue of participation that the Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth identified would say that in a nonviolent campaign, more people across the board are willing to participate. And I think that's pretty reasonable. I think many fewer people are willing to pick up a gun than are willing to engage in some kind of a nonviolent action. And I think in many societies that then opens the space for more women to be involved. Lots more research that's needed, though, to really figure out how do we think about this? What is there a difference between how women and men respond? The other thing that I've found to be very true, we've had some very interesting conversations. For example, at the University of San Diego, we had a dialogue about maybe 20 people that specifically included the ethicists from the military academies across the United States, from West Point, Annapolis, the Army War College, the Air Force Academy, other officers from the bases around San Diego, about this issue, because of course it's the military in our country who most immediately understand the consequences of war. The burden of war fighting falls on our military, and I think for that reason we found, as long as I think what is not palatable to a lot of people is if we said we can solve everything nonviolently. There's just never an occasion to use weapons or war, and we're not saying that, because at this point in history it's not true. But we have found many military to be very interested in pursuing this conversation more deeply. Yes?
I would hypothesize that the most common opinion in this country is that the peace is best kept by the threat of war, which leads to a massive buildup of arms, and when in the minds of, I think, most Americans, that peace is best kept when there's a balance of an enormous amount of power on both sides. How do your organizations react to that notion? Do you think the buildup of arms and the threat of war is a good thing? No,
I don't. It's an easy answer, but I understand that perspective. I think you're right. It seems to me that I would be encouraged by a better balance. So, for example, it seems to me that that as we invest in enormous sums of money in military preparedness at every level in all kinds of directions, we have less ability to meet the real needs of our own citizens, or to engage in the kind of, for example, diplomatic endeavors that might very well resolve conflict before it comes anywhere near being violent. I don't think we can. I don't think we're at a pretty far extreme right now in terms of military preparedness. I don't think that we can shift that in a very short period of time. But I do think that, I mean, for me, the image really is that we are so heavily invested in military preparedness that we're neglecting very important steps, investments, including what you named in the beginning, ensuring to the best of our ability that every person in the world, and this is not only the task of the United States for sure, it's the task of the global community, I believe, to ensure that every person in the world has the opportunity to live a dignified life, to imagine that they have a future, to think that they'll have a job at some point and be able to care for a family, and on and on. I think that we have come to a point, it's my personal belief, that we've come to a point that the expenditures on and production and marketing and trafficking in weapons and military preparedness is completely out of whack, out of proportion, and that and it is not only, it's certainly not only the United States, that's for sure, and it is also not, and it's not always really visible. Across Africa, people over and over say the weapons of mass destruction in Africa are hand weapons. They're small arms and hand weapons. And that at one point, I don't know if this is true or an exaggeration, but I don't think it's much of an exaggeration. In South Sudan, there were so many weapons across the country that people were using weapons as currency. I think that's problematic. Fortunes are being made in illicit trade in weapons all over the world. Fortunes are being made. And I think, so I would say that the need to begin to believe that we can actually accomplish the creation of a better, more healthy, more life-giving reality in our world, I think we need to begin to believe that we can do more without resorting to the use of military force, that there is a force of nonviolence that is very real, and we need to learn how to use it. Good. Thank you very much.